The stained glass windows of the cathedral were practically vibrating from the organ's final chord when the heavy oak doors violently slammed shut. A bride stood trembling at the altar, her in-laws screaming for the bishop to halt the ceremony, but nobody expected what happened next. Men in ceremonial armor, bearing the crest of the royal guard, barred the exits, drawing their swords. This isn't a movie script. This is the shocking true story of a wedding hijacked by bloodlines, betrayal, and absolute power. The morning of October 14th began with a deceptively gentle drizzle over the historic Cathedral of St. Bartholomew. Nestled in the most affluent sector of the city, the towering Gothic structure was a fortress of stone and stained glass, reserved only for families whose bloodlines ran as deep as the cathedral's ancient foundations. Today, it was supposed to be the venue for the society wedding of the decade. Chloe Preston was marrying Arthur Harrington. On paper, it was a fairy tale. In reality, it was a battleground. To understand the sheer gravity of this day, one must first understand the Harrington family. They were old, aristocratic money, the kind of wealth that didn't just buy mansions, but bought legislation, historical landmarks, and the silence of their enemies. Charles Harrington, the patriarch, was a man carved from marble, cold, silent, and imposing. But the true terror of the family was Arthur's mother, Margaret Harrington. Margaret was a woman who viewed her family tree not as a lineage, but as a sacred religion, and she believed with every fiber of her being that Chloe Preston was a heretic. Chloe was undeniably brilliant, a successful architect in her own right, but to Margaret, she was simply the daughter of David Preston. David was a self-made shipping magnate. He had worked his way up from the docks to the boardroom, amassing a fortune that rivaled the Harringtons. But to Margaret, new money was an unforgivable sin. It lacked the quiet dignity of inherited wealth. It lacked the royal connections. For 2 years, Margaret had orchestrated a relentless, quiet campaign to break Arthur and Chloe apart. She had strategically invited Arthur's ex-girlfriends to family galas, conveniently forgotten to include Chloe in holiday portraits, and offered devastatingly polite critiques of Chloe's upbringing. But Arthur, deeply and profoundly in love, had remained an impenetrable shield for his fiancée. As the rain tapped lightly against the vaulted windows of the bridal suite, Chloe stared at her reflection in the antique, gilded mirror. Her hands were trembling. The dress was a masterpiece of ivory silk and vintage lace, but it felt suffocatingly heavy. Sophia, her best friend and maid of honor, was frantically pacing the room with a clipboard, a Bluetooth earpiece tucked into her ear. "I don't understand," Sophia muttered, her manicured fingers tapping furiously on her phone screen. "The florist is suddenly delayed by an hour. The catering company claims they received a revised menu last night, canceling the champagne toast, and the string quartet was given the wrong sheet music. It's like someone is actively trying to sabotage the timeline." Chloe closed her eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. "It's Margaret. It has to be." "She wouldn't dare," Sophia said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Not today. Not with 300 of the most influential people in the country sitting in those pews." "You underestimate her," Chloe whispered. "She doesn't care about a public spectacle if it means getting rid of me." Right on cue, the heavy oak door of the bridal suite creaked open. There stood Margaret Harrington, draped in an icy blue designer suit, a string of flawless South Sea pearls resting against her collarbone. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. She dismissed Sophia with a mere flick of her wrist. Sophia hesitated, looking at Chloe, who gave a tiny, reassuring nod. Once the door clicked shut, the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You look acceptable," Margaret said, slowly pacing around Chloe, her eyes scanning the dress for flaws. "Though I suppose silk of that grade is notoriously difficult to tailor for someone with your proportions." Chloe refused to take the bait. She stood tall, meeting her future mother-in-law's predatory gaze. "Thank you, Margaret. The cathedral looks beautiful. I appreciate everything you've done to help coordinate." I coordinate for my son, Miss Preston. Not for you, Margaret replied, her voice dropping to a silken, dangerous whisper. She stepped closer, invading Chloe's personal space. The scent of her heavy floral perfume was nauseating. It is not too late, you know. I have a car waiting at the rear entrance. If you walk away right now, before the bells ring, I will ensure a sum of $10 million is wired to your father's offshore accounts by noon. You can claim cold feet. You can disappear with dignity. Chloe's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her voice remained frighteningly steady. I love Arthur, and he loves me. Your money means absolutely nothing. Margaret's eyes darkened, the polite veneer cracking to reveal the absolute venom beneath. Love is a fairy tale for the working class. This family is an empire, and I will not allow you to infect it. Before Chloe could respond, a sharp, frantic knock echoed through the room. Arthur's best man, Oliver, burst in, looking visibly pale. He completely ignored protocol, staring wide-eyed at Margaret, then at Chloe. Margaret, Oliver panted, out of breath. You need to come to the vestry, right now. Mr. Whitmore just arrived. Margaret's cold demeanor instantly shifted into a mask of triumph. She looked back at Chloe, her lips curling into a sinister smirk. We shall see about that wedding, my dear. As Margaret swept out of the room, Chloe's stomach plummeted. Mr. Whitmore was the Harringtons' absolute most ruthless corporate attorney, a man nicknamed The Undertaker because when he showed up, someone's livelihood was about to be buried. Why was he at the cathedral an hour before the ceremony? The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin, and for the first time that morning, Chloe genuinely feared the wedding might not happen. Across the cathedral, in the dimly lit, oak-paneled vestry, Arthur Harrington was adjusting his bow tie when his mother swept into the room, followed closely by Charles and the imposing figure of Mr. Eris Whitmore. Whitmore carried a thick, leather-bound folder. Arthur turned, his brow furrowing. It was highly irregular for the family lawyer to be present at a family wedding, let alone hovering like an executioner in the groom's dressing room. What is going on? Arthur demanded, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Mother, why is Eris here? Charles Harrington cleared his throat, looking uncharacteristically nervous, but it was Margaret who stepped forward, radiating cold authority. Arthur, darling, please sit down. We have something terrible to tell you, and we wanted to shield you from it until we had absolute proof. Arthur didn't sit. He crossed his arms. Proof of what? Whitmore placed the heavy leather folder onto the antique mahogany table and flipped it open. Arthur, we have been conducting a quiet, thorough audit of David Preston's shipping empire. As your future father-in-law, his financial stability reflects on the Harrington name. Unfortunately, what we found is not just instability, it is criminal. Arthur scoffed, shaking his head. David is a self-made man. He's ruthlessly audited by the state. You're grasping at straws, Mother. Look at the documents, Arthur. Margaret snapped, her composure slipping into desperate aggression. He has been running a massive offshore embezzlement scheme, funneling millions through shell companies in the Cayman Islands. It's racketeering, Arthur. If you marry that girl and this goes public, which it will, our family will be dragged into a federal investigation. Your political future, gone. The family trust, frozen. You are walking into a trap. Arthur stepped up to the table, his eyes scanning the documents. Bank statements, wire transfers, corporate registrations with David Preston's supposed signatures. It looked incredibly damning. It looked perfectly real. But Arthur knew David. He knew the man's fierce integrity. More importantly, he knew his mother. You fabricated this, Arthur said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous octave. I did no such thing, Margaret gasped, clutching her pearls in feigned outrage. Eris procured these directly from an inside whistleblower. Arthur, you must cancel this wedding. Go out there, tell the bishop you cannot proceed, and we will handle the fallout. I am trying to save your life. Meanwhile, in the bridal suite, panic had fully erupted. Sophia had just helped Chloe lift the heavy train of the dress when she let out a horrified gasp. the delicate, vintage Chantilly lace at the back of the gown, a family heirloom that belonged to Chloe's late mother, Evelyn, had been brutally slashed. It wasn't a snag or a tear from a shoe. It was a clean, jagged, deliberate cut from a pair of shears running nearly 2 feet up the silk. Chloe dropped to her knees, staring at the ruined fabric, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes. The sabotage had moved from logistical annoyances to deeply personal, physical destruction. She ruined it. She actually ruined my mother's dress. "Don't you dare cry, Chloe Preston," Sophia fiercely commanded, dropping to the floor beside her, instantly producing a travel sewing kit. "We have 20 minutes. Stand up. I'm going to safety pin and stitch this from the inside. It will look like a bustle. Margaret wants you to break. Do not give that wicked woman the satisfaction." As Sophia worked frantically, the door flew open again. This time it was Arthur. He had bypassed the groomsman, his face pale, his jaw set in stone. He saw Chloe's tear-stained face and the ruined dress, and a profound, furious clarity washed over him. He rushed to her, pulling her into a tight embrace, uncaring about wrinkling his tuxedo. "Arthur, you're not supposed to see me," Chloe sobbed into his shoulder. "The dress, everything is falling apart." "Listen to me," Arthur said, pulling back to frame her face with his hands. "My parents just tried to show me a fabricated legal dossier accusing your father of federal crimes. They threatened to leak it to the press if I didn't walk away right now." Chloe froze, the blood draining from her face. "My father? Arthur, no, he would never—" "I know," Arthur interrupted fiercely. "I know he wouldn't, which is why I called him down here." From the hallway, David Preston stepped into the room. He was a large, imposing man, with kind eyes but a jawline that revealed his dock worker past. He didn't look panicked. He looked thoroughly unamused. "Arthur told me about the so-called Cayman accounts," David said, his voice a deep, calming rumble. "Chloe, sweetheart, I knew Margaret had private investigators digging into my company for months. What she doesn't know is that I set up a trap. The shell companies in those documents, I created them specifically as honeypots, registered under dummy names, to see who was trying to steal corporate data. Your mother-in-law just bought stolen fake documents. And the best part, the IP addresses of the hackers traced directly back to a firm paid by Charles Harrington." Chloe gasped, looking between her father and her fiancé. "They committed corporate espionage to stop a wedding." "They are desperate," Arthur said, his voice laced with cold resolve. "And they have failed. Chloe, we are walking down that aisle. If they want a war, they will get one in front of 300 witnesses." Determined, the dress hastily pinned, Chloe took her father's arm. As they made their way toward the grand nave, word of Arthur's defiance reached the vestry. Margaret Harrington stood by the window, watching the rain intensify, realizing her blackmail had entirely collapsed. Her hands shook with a rage so absolute it bordered on madness. She pulled a slim, encrypted satellite phone from her purse and dialed a private number. "The bluff failed," Margaret hissed into the receiver, her voice devoid of all humanity. "They are proceeding to the altar. Execute the injunction. I don't care how much of a scene it causes. Stop them at all costs." Outside the cathedral, the gentle drizzle had turned into a torrential downpour. Unnoticed by the guests sitting warmly inside, a convoy of 6 black, unmarked tactical vehicles silently pulled onto the cobblestone square, boxing in the cathedral's heavy oak front doors. The real nightmare was only just beginning. The grand nave of the Cathedral of St. Bartholomew was a spectacle of staggering opulence, a master class in wealth masquerading as piety. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the ancient stone pillars, their sweet scent warring with the smell of burning beeswax candles and centuries-old incense. The pews were packed with the absolute elite of high society. Politicians, foreign diplomats, and titans of industry whispered behind programs printed on heavy gold-leaf parchment. Among them sat the directors of Coots Private Banking, the quiet managers of the Harrington family's immense wealth, lending an air of brutal financial reality to the religious setting. This was not merely a union of two people, it was a merger of power, a public theater where any deviation from the script would be heavily penalized. In the very front pew, Margaret Harrington sat with the rigid posture of a reigning monarch. She had abandoned the pretense of maternal joy. Her eyes were fixed on the grand altar, her expression an unreadable mask of cold marble. Beside her, Charles Harrington nervously adjusted his immaculate tuxedo cuffs, acutely aware of the dangerous game his wife was playing. He had seen the absolute fury in Arthur's eyes during their vestry confrontation, and Charles, for all his corporate ruthlessness, possessed a deep fear of public humiliation. Margaret, however, possessed no such fear. She only cared about winning. She checked her diamond-encrusted wristwatch. The injunction she had ordered was due to be executed any minute. At the altar stood Bishop Thomas Caldwell, a man whose tenure at the cathedral was largely funded by the Harrington family's generous endowments. He looked distinctly uncomfortable, sensing the violent undercurrents swirling beneath the polished surface of the ceremony. To his right stood Arthur, an immovable pillar of defiance. He refused to look at his parents. His gaze was locked firmly on the back of the cathedral, waiting for the massive oak doors to open. Beside him, Oliver, the best man, shifted his weight nervously, scanning the side aisles as if expecting an attack. Suddenly, the massive pipe organ roared to life, the deep, vibrating chords of the processional echoing through the vaulted stone ceiling. The murmurs in the pews instantly silenced. The heavy wooden doors at the rear of the nave slowly pulled inward, revealing a silhouette that made Arthur's breath catch in his throat. Chloe Preston stood at the threshold, her arm linked tightly through her father's. Despite the frantic, hidden safety pins holding the slashed vintage lace of her gown together, she looked absolutely breathtaking. She held her chin high, her eyes locking directly onto Arthur's. There was no trace of the trembling, terrified bride who had wept in the dressing room. In her place was a woman forged in fire, fully prepared to claim her future, regardless of the dragons guarding the gates. As David Preston escorted his daughter down the central aisle, the guests turned, their faces a mixture of admiration and quiet judgment. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rhythmic rustle of silk and the solemn booming of the organ. Chloe felt the weight of hundreds of eyes, but the only gaze that mattered was Arthur's. He offered her a small, fiercely protective smile. When they finally reached the altar, David did not immediately hand Chloe over. He turned to Arthur, his massive, calloused hand, gripping the younger man's shoulder with iron strength. "She is my entire world, Arthur," David murmured, his voice low enough that only the groom and the bishop could hear. "Protect her from the wolves." "With my life, David," Arthur replied without a second of hesitation. David pressed a kiss to Chloe's cheek and took his seat on the left side of the aisle, separated from the Harringtons by an ocean of unspoken hostility. Chloe stepped up to the altar, taking Arthur's hands. His grip was warm and grounding. For a brief, shining moment, the rest of the world melted away. There was no corporate espionage, no slashed dresses, no malicious mother-in-law. There was only the man she loved, standing in the flickering candlelight, ready to vow his life to hers. Bishop Caldwell cleared his throat, opening his gilded missal. "Dearly beloved," his voice rang out, amplified by the cathedral's flawless acoustics. "We are gathered here today in the sight of God, and in the presence of these witnesses, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." In the front row, Margaret Harrington's fingers tightened around her velvet clutch. She glanced toward the stained glass windows. The rain was battering the glass with increasing violence. The timing was taking too long. Her hired legal team should have breached the perimeter by now. "If anyone can show just cause why they may not lawfully be joined together," the bishop intoned, pausing purely out of liturgical habit, "let them speak now, or forever hold their peace." The silence in the cathedral stretched, taut as a wire. Margaret opened her mouth, fully prepared to stand and halt the proceedings herself, if her operatives had failed. But before a single syllable could escape her perfectly painted lips, a sound like a thunderclap shattered the quiet. The heavy, iron-reinforced oak doors at the rear of the cathedral were thrown violently open, crashing against the stone walls with a deafening bang. The organist abruptly stopped playing. 300 guests turned in their pews, gasping in collective shock. Standing in the entrance was not Margaret's high-priced legal team, nor was it Eris Whitmore brandishing an emergency injunction. Instead, a wall of imposing dark figures blocked the light from the stormy courtyard. A collective murmur of sheer bewilderment rippled through the high society congregation. The figures filling the doorway were not police officers, nor were they private security. They were clad in the ceremonial, yet highly functional, tactical armor of the Sovereign's Royal Guard, a deeply elite and historically fearsome unit, completely separate from standard military divisions. Their breastplates gleamed under the cathedral lights, bearing the ancient gold crest of the crown. Heavy woolen cloaks, saturated from the torrential rain, hung heavily from their broad shoulders, and at their hips hung long, ceremonial broadswords, weapons that, while historical in appearance, were devastatingly real and currently unlatched from their scabbards. Margaret Harrington bolted to her feet, her composure entirely shattered. "What is the meaning of this?" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly over the terrified whispers of the guests. "Security. Remove these men at once. This is a private, closed ceremony." The cathedral's hired security guards, beefy men in tailored suits, hesitated, exchanging panicked glances. "You do not lay hands on the royal guard without inviting a charge of treason." They remained frozen against the side walls. From the center of the armored formation, a tall, striking commander stepped forward. His boots clicked aggressively against the ancient stone floor as he marched down the center aisle. He bypassed the screaming Margaret Harrington without so much as a glance, his eyes fixed entirely on the altar. He came to a halt, precisely 10 paces from where Chloe and Arthur stood. "Arthur Harrington, Chloe Preston," the commander barked, his voice carrying the rough, undeniable weight of absolute authority. "By order of the Crown Council and the ancient laws governing this sanctuary, you are to remain exactly where you are." Arthur immediately stepped in front of Chloe, shielding her with his body, his jaw clenched. "On whose authority do you interrupt my wedding?" he demanded. The commander did not flinch. He reached inside his heavy cloak and produced a heavy roll of parchment sealed with thick red wax. "On the authority of the Royal Peculiar Jurisdiction," he announced, holding the document aloft, "and upon the direct petition of a bloodline older than the stones of this very building." Before anyone could process the statement, the sound of heavy mechanized clanking echoed from the rear of the cathedral. The remaining knights were physically pulling the massive oak doors shut. With a horrific, grinding thud, the doors met. A knight produced a massive iron crossbar, sliding it into the brackets with a resounding clang that rattled the stained glass. They had locked everyone inside. Panic erupted. Guests leapt from their pews, shouting in confusion and outrage. Diplomats demanded their phones, only to realize that a localized signal jammer had completely wiped out all cellular reception within the thick stone walls. The cathedral was entirely cut off from the outside world. Margaret, vibrating with a rage so potent it looked like a physical seizure, pushed past the guests and stormed up the aisle toward the commander. "You are trespassing on privately leased grounds," she spat, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at his face. "My family paid for this cathedral today. I have a court-ordered injunction arriving at this very moment to halt this wedding due to federal criminal investigations." The commander finally looked at Margaret, his expression one of profound, icy contempt. "Your injunction, Mrs. Harrington, is currently floating in the gutters of the courtyard, along with the heavily bribed process servers you sent to deliver it." Margaret gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. Charles Harrington, finally spurred into action by the sheer scale of the disaster, rushed to his wife's side. "See here," Charles bellowed. "You cannot hold us hostage. I will have your rank for this. Who authorized a royal guard deployment to a civilian wedding?" "I did." The voice was not loud, but it possessed a quiet, rumbling gravity that instantly cut through the chaos. Every head swiveled toward the left side of the altar. David Preston stood up from his pew. He didn't look like a self-made shipping magnate. He didn't look like a dock worker who had fought his way into high society. As he stepped out into the center aisle, buttoning his suit jacket, he carried an air of terrifying inherited command. Chloe stared at her father, completely bewildered. "Dad, what is going on?" David offered his daughter a gentle, reassuring smile before turning his hard gaze upon the Harringtons. "For 2 years, Margaret, I have watched you torture my daughter. I watched you belittle her, attempt to frame me for corporate embezzlement, and try to buy her off with your newly minted banking fortunes. I tolerated it because Chloe loved Arthur, and I promised my late wife Evelyn that I would let our daughter live a normal, quiet life." David walked slowly toward the commander, who immediately snapped to rigid attention, dipping his head in a deep, deferential bow. The entire congregation gasped in unison. "But you pushed too far today," David continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You assumed my family was new money. You assumed we were defenseless peasants you could crush with a bribe and a fabricated legal document." David turned to face the terrified crowd, his eyes locking on Margaret. "My late wife, Evelyn, was not just a school teacher. She was the direct, unacknowledged descendant of the House of Plantagenet. And as her widower and the guardian of her bloodline, I hold the ancestral rights to the royal peculiar protection of this very cathedral." Margaret's face drained of all color, her arrogant facade crumbling into dust. She stumbled backward, caught only by Charles. David gestured to the heavily armed knights guarding the sealed doors. "These men are not here to stop the wedding, Margaret. They are here to ensure it finishes without any further interference from you, your corrupt lawyers, or your pathetic injunctions. No one leaves this sanctuary until my daughter is a married woman." The silence that followed David Preston's declaration was absolute and suffocating. Inside the vast, vaulted expanse of the Cathedral of St. Bartholomew, 300 of the most powerful individuals in the country collectively stopped breathing. The only sounds in the colossal stone structure were the relentless, violent drumming of the rain against the stained glass windows and the heavy, metallic clinking of the royal knights adjusting their grips on their ceremonial broadswords. The sheer audacity of the claim hung in the air like smoke. To claim direct descent from the House of Plantagenet, one of the most fiercely debated and meticulously tracked historical bloodlines, was practically a declaration of sovereign immunity. To claim it in the middle of a high society wedding, backed by heavily armed royal enforcers, was an event that would shatter social hierarchies for decades. Margaret Harrington's face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered revulsion. She gripped the polished oak edge of the front pew so tightly her knuckles turned entirely white. The very foundation of her reality, the absolute superiority of her inherited wealth and her meticulously curated social standing, was actively collapsing around her. "You are lying!" she screamed, her voice cracking, completely devoid of her usual aristocratic polish. "The Plantagenet line has been aggressively catalogued. There are no hidden branches hiding in the squalor of the working class. This is a theatrical farce, David. You hired these actors to humiliate my family because you know you are bankrupt and facing federal prison." Before David could even respond to her desperate accusation, the commander of the Royal Guard stepped forward. His movements were terrifyingly precise, carrying the lethal grace of a man who did not play political games. From beneath his heavy, rain-soaked woolen cloak, he withdrew a secondary document. It was bound in ancient, cracked leather and bore the unmistakable, heavy wax seal of the Crown Archivist. He held it out not toward Margaret, but toward Bishop Thomas Caldwell, who was practically trembling behind his gilded altar. "Bishop Caldwell," the commander stated, his voice a low, threatening rumble that carried effortlessly across the silent nave. You are a custodian of a royal peculiar sanctuary, directly answerable only to the sovereign, not the local diocese. You know the seals. Examine the cipher." The bishop, wiping beads of cold sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed linen handkerchief, hesitantly stepped forward. He adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and peered at the heavy wax seal, his hands shaking violently. He traced the intricate, raised crest with a trembling finger. The entire congregation leaned forward, practically holding their collective breath. The bishop looked up, his face entirely devoid of color. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the furious Margaret Harrington, then back to the immovable commander. "The seal is authentic," the bishop whispered, though in the dead silence it sounded like a shout. "By the ancient decrees of sanctuary, the bloodline is recognized. The Preston family holds the protective rights of this ground. I cannot countermand this order. The doors must remain sealed until the requested rites are concluded." Chaos immediately threatened to break out in the pews. A prominent investment banker, a man used to buying his way out of any inconvenience, abruptly stood up from the fourth row. "This is a gross violation of our civil liberties," he bellowed, straightening his tailored suit jacket. "I have a flight to Geneva in 3 hours. Move out of the way, or I will have my security detail tear those doors down." He took exactly 3 steps into the center aisle before 2 knights detached themselves from the barricade. They did not draw their swords, but the synchronized, heavy thud of their armored boots against the stone floor was enough to make the banker freeze in his tracks. The knights crossed their heavy, steel-gauntleted arms, forming an impenetrable wall of armor and muscle. Any attempt to breach a sealed royal peculiar during an active invocation is considered a direct act of treason against the crown, the commander announced, not even looking at the banker. "Return to your seat, sir, or you will be restrained and processed under military tribunal." The banker turned pale, slowly backing away and sinking into his pew without another word. The sheer, overwhelming reality of the situation finally settled over the crowd. Their billions of dollars, their corporate influence, and their political connections were entirely useless here. They were trapped inside a medieval legal loophole governed by men who answered only to a power far older than modern currency. At the altar, Chloe was staring at her father in profound shock. The ruined, slashed lace of her mother's dress suddenly felt impossibly heavy. "Dad," she breathed, her voice trembling with emotion. "Mom never told me. She never said a word about any of this. Why?" David's hard exterior softened instantly as he looked at his daughter. He stepped closer, his eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful warmth. "Because she despised it, sweetheart. She watched her own parents become obsessed with titles and archaic prestige, watching it destroy their happiness. When she met me on the docks, she wanted nothing more than a quiet, ordinary life. She swore to me she would never use the bloodline unless it was a matter of absolute, undeniable necessity. She wanted you to be valued for your mind, your kindness, and your work, not for a ghost of a crown." David turned his gaze back to Margaret, who was now leaning heavily against her husband, breathing in ragged, shallow gasps. "I honored her wish," David said, his voice hardening once more. "I built my own fortune. I let the world think I was just a lucky dock worker. But when your private investigators started hacking my servers, Margaret, and when you threatened to ruin my daughter's future with fabricated federal charges, you forced my hand. I invoked the seal not for pride, but for protection." Arthur, who had remained silent throughout the explosive revelation, gently squeezed Chloe's hand. He didn't look at the royal seal, nor did he look at the heavily armed knights guarding the exits. He looked only at the woman standing beside him, her beautiful dress maliciously sabotaged, yet radiating a strength that completely eclipsed his own family's wealth. "It doesn't change anything," Arthur said fiercely, loud enough for his parents to hear. "Royal blood or not, she is the woman I love, and nothing you do will stop me from putting a ring on her finger." Margaret Harrington was a woman backed into an impossible corner. But decades of corporate and social dominance had hardwired her to never surrender, even when staring down absolute defeat. She pushed herself away from Charles, smoothing the front of her icy blue designer suit with shaking hands. If she could not break the legal seal of the sanctuary, she would break the groom. "Arthur, you are making a catastrophic mistake," Margaret shouted, stepping out into the aisle, though she smartly kept her distance from the royal guard. "If you proceed with this marriage, you are legally binding yourself to a family actively under investigation. Royal seal or no royal seal, the documents heiress Whitmore possesses prove David Preston is running offshore embezzlement schemes. I will drag that information to the press myself. The Harrington Trust will cut you off entirely. You will leave this cathedral with nothing but the clothes on your back." Heiress Whitmore, the ruthless corporate attorney who had hovered silently near the front pews, finally saw an opening to assert his expertise. He straightened his tie and stepped forward, clutching his heavy leather briefcase. "Commander," Whitmore said, adopting his most persuasive courtroom tone, "while I respect the archaic sanctuary laws you are enforcing, you are inadvertently harboring a man suspected of massive federal financial crimes. As an officer of the court, I must inform you that—" "Silence yourself, Mr. Whitmore," the commander interrupted, his voice cracking like a whip. "You are utterly out of your depth." The commander reached into his cloak a second time, producing a thick, modern manila envelope. He tossed it casually onto the polished stone floor at Whitmore's feet. It landed with a heavy, definitive slap. "Those are not your fabricated banking documents," the commander stated, his eyes locking onto Charles Harrington, who instantly recoiled. "Those are the digital forensic reports compiled by the Crown's Cybersecurity Division over the last 48 hours. When you hired a black hat mercenary firm to hack into what you thought was a civilian shipping company, you unknowingly breached servers registered to a protected ward of the Crown. That is not corporate espionage, Mr. Harrington. That is a direct hostile cyber attack on a sovereign entity." Charles Harrington's jaw dropped. The terrifying reality of his wife's obsessive vendetta suddenly crashed down upon him. He had signed the checks to the private investigators. He had authorized the aggressive digital probing, trusting Margaret's assurance that it would be untraceable. "We have the wire transfers," the commander continued mercilessly. "We have the IP logs. And as of 20 minutes ago, while you were sitting in these pews, federal authorities, acting on our intelligence, raided the offices of the Harrington Financial Trust. All assets are currently frozen, pending a tribunal investigation for treasonous espionage." A horrified collective gasp erupted from the congregation. The elite guests, who just moments ago were annoyed at being delayed, now looked at the Harringtons as if they were infected with the plague. Social alliances in their world were built on wealth and invulnerability. With one sentence, the commander had stripped the Harringtons of both. Charles turned on Margaret, his face purple with a sudden, violent rage. "You swore to me the firm was discreet," he hissed, grabbing her by the arm. "You told me it was a routine background check. You arrogant, foolish woman. You have destroyed us. You have destroyed the entire company just because you couldn't stand her pedigree." "Don't you dare blame this on me, Charles," Margaret shrieked, batting his hand away, completely losing her aristocratic composure in front of 300 horrified peers. "I was protecting our legacy." "There is no legacy left," Charles roared back. The united, terrifying front of the Harrington patriarch and matriarch completely shattered, devolving into a bitter, vicious argument in the middle of the cathedral aisle. Arthur watched his parents tear each other apart, a profound sadness mixing with immense relief. The toxic empire that had loomed over his entire life was burning to the ground, and he realized he felt absolutely no desire to save it. He turned his back on them, facing the terrified Bishop Caldwell. "Bishop," Arthur said, his voice calm, steady, and echoing with absolute certainty. "My parents are no longer part of this ceremony. I formally renounce my position within the Harrington Family Trust. Now, if you please, we have a wedding to finish." The bishop, realizing that the young man standing before him was the only person in the room possessing any shred of moral authority, nodded frantically. He practically sprinted back to his gilded missal, finding his lost place on the page. Arthur turned back to Chloe. He reached out, gently tracing the line of her jaw, completely ignoring the chaotic whispering of the crowd and the armed knights guarding the doors. "I am so sorry for what they did to you," he whispered, his eyes flicking down to the slashed lace of her mother's dress. "I will spend the rest of my life making up for this day." Chloe smiled, a radiant, tearful expression that lit up the dimly lit altar. "You already are," she replied softly. "You stayed. Always," Arthur promised. The bishop cleared his throat, his voice finally projecting with some semblance of religious authority. "Arthur, do you take Chloe to be your lawfully wedded wife, to live together in the estate of matrimony? Will you love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health, forsaking all others, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Arthur said, slipping a simple, elegant diamond band onto Chloe's trembling finger. It wasn't the massive Harrington family heirloom ruby. He had left that in the vestry. It was a ring he had bought himself, with his own money. "And Chloe," the bishop continued, "do you take Arthur to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Chloe looked out over the crowd. She saw her father, beaming with unrestrained pride. She saw the furious, defeated faces of her former abusers, and she saw the ancient stone walls that had protected her bloodline for centuries. She looked back at Arthur, her heart incredibly full. "I do," she said, her voice ringing clear and triumphant through the sealed sanctuary. "Then, by the power vested in me and under the protection of this sacred, sealed ground," the bishop proclaimed, snapping the missal shut, "I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." As Arthur pulled Chloe into a deep, passionate kiss, the heavy silence of the cathedral was finally broken. The best man, Oliver, let out a loud, echoing cheer. Sophia, the maid of honor, clapped furiously, tears streaming down her face. A few seconds later, David Preston joined in, and soon a hesitant but growing wave of applause rolled through the pews. Even in the face of absolute social destruction, the undeniable victory of love and truth demanded recognition. The royal knights remained perfectly still, their swords sheathed, but their presence a silent, ironclad guarantee. The doors would not open until the new Mr. and Mrs. Harrington were ready to walk out into the storm, entirely on their own terms. The applause that had rippled through the nave slowly dissolved into a heavy, uncertain silence as the reality of the situation reasserted itself. Arthur and Chloe stood at the altar, their hands tightly intertwined, radiating a calm defiance that stood in stark contrast to the absolute pandemonium brewing in the pews. They had secured their union, but the cathedral doors remained barred by men holding naked broadswords, and the patriarch and matriarch of the Harrington family were currently facing a tribunal investigation for sovereign espionage. The guests, an elite assembly of diplomats, tech billionaires, and politicians, suddenly realized that the very air they were breathing was legally compromised. Margaret Harrington, her icy blue suit visibly rumpled and her perfectly styled hair falling in erratic wisps around her face, refused to accept her demise. Decades of viewing herself as the apex predator of high society made her entirely incapable of processing defeat. She whipped her head around, her wild eyes scanning the congregation for a lifeline. She locked eyes with Gregory Pierce, a highly influential media mogul who had dined at her estate no less than 4 times that very month. "Gregory!" Margaret called out, her voice shrill, echoing awkwardly off the stone walls. "Gregory, you have the ear of the Prime Minister. Call your people, have this ridiculous military theater shut down immediately. This is a gross abuse of power over a simple misunderstanding." Gregory Pierce, a man whose entire empire relied on positive public perception and immaculate political alliances, did not move to help her. Instead, he slowly, deliberately averted his eyes, physically shifting his shoulders to face the altar, completely shutting her out. The rejection was palpable, a silent social guillotine dropping in front of 300 witnesses. Panic surged through Margaret's veins. She turned to the other side of the aisle. "Senator Davies, you sit on the Oversight Committee. You know Charles and I are upstanding citizens. Tell this commander to release us." Senator Davies, a man whose campaign had been largely funded by the Harrington Trust, looked as though he had swallowed a lemon. He cleared his throat, sinking slightly lower into the wooden pew. "Margaret, please lower your voice," the senator muttered, refusing to meet her gaze. "If federal authorities are currently raiding your financial trust on suspicion of sovereign espionage, I cannot legally or morally intervene. You are entirely on your own." The sheer, staggering isolation hit Margaret like a physical blow. These were her people. These were the sycophants who drank her vintage champagne, sailed on her yachts, and kissed her cheeks at charity galas. And in the span of 20 minutes, they had completely abandoned her, treating her as though she were radioactive. In the ruthless ecosystem of old money and immense power, loyalty was entirely conditional, and the Harringtons had just become the ultimate liability. Charles Harrington, meanwhile, was frantically pressing buttons on his smartphone, ignoring the fact that the localized signal jammer was still fully active. His face was a mottled, unhealthy shade of crimson. "We need a fixer," Charles muttered to himself, his breath coming in shallow, panicked rasps. "We need to move the offshore accounts before the tribunal freezes the secondary ledgers. Aris, where are you?" Aris Whitmore, the supposedly terrifying corporate attorney, was currently demonstrating the exact opposite of courage. Realizing that his involvement in procuring the hacked documents implicated him in federal conspiracy charges, Whitmore had been slowly, silently inching his way toward the side nave, hoping to slip through the arched cloisters and find a maintenance exit. He had almost reached the shadows of a massive stone pillar when a heavy, gauntleted hand clamped down onto his shoulder with bone-crushing force. Whitmore let out a pathetic, stifled yelp. A royal knight, standing well over 6 feet tall and clad in rain-darkened armor, dragged the lawyer back into the light of the central aisle, tossing him unceremoniously onto the stone floor near Charles Harrington. "There will be no quiet exits today, Mr. Whitmore," the commander stated, his voice a low, commanding rumble that cut through the whispering crowd. "The perimeter is entirely secured. You will all face the music you composed." At the altar, David Preston watched the utter collapse of his enemies with a stoic, unreadable expression. He did not gloat. He did not smile. He simply watched the natural consequences of their hubris consume them. He turned his attention to the commander, offering a brief, respectful nod. "Commander," David said, his deep voice carrying an authority that required no shouting. "The sanctuary has served its purpose. The vows have been spoken, and my daughter is safe. I formally request that the royal seal on the doors be lifted." The commander snapped to attention, striking his armored fist against his breastplate in a crisp, ancient salute. "As the bloodline dictates, so it shall be," the commander replied. He turned toward the heavy oak doors at the rear of the nave and raised his right hand. "Disengage the crossbar. Break the seal." The knights stationed at the rear moved with frightening synchronization. 2 men grabbed the massive iron crossbar, hauling it upward with a deafening metallic screech that made several guests jump in their seats. The bar was pulled free and dropped heavily into its stone brackets. The heavy iron bolts were thrown back. With a deep, resonant groan, the ancient oak doors were slowly pulled open, letting the blinding, chaotic reality of the outside world spill into the sacred, candle-lit space. The storm had not abated. Heavy sheets of rain washed over the cobblestone courtyard. But it was not the rain that made the congregation gasp. It was the sea of flashing red and blue lights waiting precisely at the bottom of the cathedral steps. Through the open doors, the high society guests could clearly see the courtyard was swarming with federal law enforcement, UV, armored transport vehicles, completely distinct from the Royal Guard's tactical convoy, blocked the street. Agents in windbreakers bearing the insignia of the National Financial Crimes Bureau stood in the pouring rain streaming off their stern faces, waiting patiently at the threshold of the consecrated ground. They could not enter the cathedral, but they didn't need to. The Harringtons had to come out. The commander gestured toward the open doors. Charles Harrington, Margaret Harrington, heiress Whitmore, your sanctuary has expired. You will walk out of those doors, or my men will physically carry you to the federal marshals. The choice is yours, though I strongly suggest you retain whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left. Charles Harrington looked completely broken. The imposing, ruthless corporate titan had vanished, replaced by an aging, terrified man facing the absolute ruin of a multi-generational empire. He didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at his son. He simply lowered his head, staring at the ancient stone floor, and began the long, agonizing walk down the central aisle. Heiress Whitmore scrambled to his feet, clutching his ruined leather briefcase like a shield, and scurried closely behind Charles, his head bowed to avoid the piercing, judgmental stares of the congregation. But Margaret refused to bow her head. Even as she walked the exact path she had planned for her triumphant exit as the mother of the groom, she kept her chin violently high, her eyes flashing with a desperate, manic defiance. She glared at the guests who had abandoned her, her gaze lingering on Gregory Pierce and Senator Davies with venomous intensity. But when she reached the threshold of the cathedral doors, the facade finally cracked. Two federal agents immediately stepped forward, rain pouring off their shoulders, and produced heavy steel handcuffs. The distinct, metallic click of the restraints snapping around Margaret's diamond-adorned wrists echoed loudly into the silent nave. It was the absolute, undeniable sound of the Harrington Empire ending. "Take your hands off me," Margaret hissed, violently trying to jerk her arms away, though the agents held her with practiced, immovable ease. "I am Margaret Harrington. You do not treat me like common street trash. Arthur, tell them." She twisted around, looking desperately back up the long aisle toward the altar, searching for the son she had spent 29 years attempting to control. Arthur stood next to Chloe, his face a portrait of tranquil resolution. He did not step forward. He did not raise his voice. He simply looked at the woman who had tried to destroy the love of his life, and in a quiet, firm voice that nonetheless carried across the silent room, he spoke his final words to her. "You are no longer my family. Goodbye, Margaret." Margaret's eyes widened in sheer horror as the federal agents firmly guided her out into the torrential rain, shoving her roughly into the back of an unmarked, heavily armored vehicle. The doors slammed shut, cutting off her frantic screaming. Charles and Nerys were loaded into a second vehicle, their heads shielded by the agents to prevent the rapidly gathering press corps from snapping clear photos of their disgraced faces. Within moments, the convoy of law enforcement peeled away from the cobblestone square, taking the ashes of the Harrington legacy with them. Inside the cathedral, the suffocating tension finally broke. A collective, massive exhale swept through the pews. The guests, unsure of standard protocol following the arrest of the hosts, began to murmur amongst themselves, slowly rising from their seats. Arthur turned to Chloe, offering her his arm. "Well, Mrs. Harrington," he said, a genuine, luminous smile finally breaking across his face. "I believe we have a reception to attend." Chloe laughed, a bright, musical sound that completely dispelled the lingering darkness in the room. She gathered the slashed, pinned layers of her mother's vintage lace gown, holding the fabric with a fierce pride. "I believe we do, Mr. Harrington, though I think we might be paying for the catering ourselves." "I wouldn't have it any other way," Arthur replied. They began their walk down the aisle. This time there was no wedding march playing. The organist had long since abandoned his post in shock. But the silence was filled with something much better as Arthur and Chloe walked past the pews. The guests, the elite bankers, the politicians, the socialites, instinctively stepped back, parting like the Red Sea. They did not just step back out of respect. They stepped back out of profound awe. They were looking at a man who had walked away from billions for love, and a woman who carried the blood of kings without ever needing to boast about it. David Preston followed closely behind them, his arm securely around Sophia, the maid of honor, who was practically bouncing on her heels with adrenaline. Oliver, the best man, brought up the rear, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at the events he had just witnessed. As the bridal party reached the open doors, the commander of the Royal Guard stood at attention. As Chloe passed, he and his heavily armored men drew their broadswords in unison, raising them high into the air to form an arched canopy of gleaming steel over the cathedral exit. It was the highest martial honor the crown could bestow, a silent tribute to the bloodline she carried and the immense grace she had shown. Chloe paused beneath the crossed swords, looking at the commander. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." "It is our eternal privilege, ma'am," the commander replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners in a rare, genuine expression of warmth. "Long may you reign over your own life." Arthur and Chloe stepped out from beneath the steel arch and into the cool, rain-washed air of the courtyard. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, clean scent of ozone and wet cobblestone. A sleek, unassuming black town car, rented quietly by David Preston the day before, was idling near the gates. There was no Harrington limousine, there was no heavily orchestrated press rollout. There was only the quiet, beautiful beginning of a life they had fought ruthlessly to protect. Hand in hand, unbothered by the damp air, they walked out of the shadows of the past and into the bright, unwritten future. The sleek, black town car glided smoothly through the rain-slicked streets of the city, leaving the towering medieval spires of the Cathedral of St. Bartholomew far behind. Inside the quiet cabin, the only sound was the rhythmic hum of the tires against the wet pavement, and the gentle, reassuring rhythm of Arthur's thumb stroking the back of Chloe's hand. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the suffocating, omnipresent weight of the Harrington family expectations had completely vanished. The air felt lighter. The world outside the tinted windows, though battered by the storm, looked incredibly new. Instead of heading toward the ultra-exclusive Grand Plaza Hotel, where Margaret Harrington had meticulously orchestrated a suffocatingly rigid, 6-course reception designed solely to show off her wealth, David's driver navigated toward the historic Harbor District. The car pulled up to the Preston shipping yards, stopping in front of a massive, beautifully restored 19th-century brick warehouse. David Preston had always been a man who prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. Knowing Margaret's capacity for malice, he had secretly arranged a parallel reception at his own property. As Arthur and Chloe stepped out of the car, shielded by an umbrella held by the driver, they were greeted by a sight that literally stole Chloe's breath away. The cavernous warehouse had been transformed into a breathtaking, industrial chic wonderland. Thousands of warm, amber fairy lights hung from the exposed steel rafters, casting a golden glow over long, rustic wooden tables adorned with simple, elegant cascades of white roses and lush greenery. A live jazz band was warming up in the corner, their smooth notes floating through the air. There were no ice sculptures, no caviar stations, and no rigid seating charts designed to separate the elite from the supposedly unworthy. There was just warmth, fantastic food, and genuine joy. As the bridal party arrived, Sophia immediately pulled Chloe into a makeshift dressing room in the back office. With a pair of proper fabric shears and an infectious, rebellious grin, Sophia went to work on the sabotaged wedding gown. Instead of trying to hide Margaret's malicious cut, Sophia boldly altered the back of the dress, transforming the slashed vintage lace into a stunning, asymmetrical, open-back design. It no longer looked like a damaged heirloom. It looked like a masterpiece of high fashion, a physical representation of turning a vicious attack into a beautiful triumph. When Chloe emerged, Arthur looked at her with such profound adoration that the rest of the room seemingly melted away. He pulled her onto the polished concrete dance floor just as the band struck up a slow, soulful melody. While they danced, the outside world was rapidly descending into absolute chaos. With the localized signal jammer at the cathedral finally disabled, the mobile phones of the elite guests began detonating with breaking news alerts. The financial world was experiencing a tectonic shift. Bloomberg and the Financial Times were simultaneously pushing out emergency bulletins. The Harrington Family Trust had been entirely frozen by federal marshals. The global markets, reacting to the arrests of Charles and Margaret Harrington for sovereign espionage, were aggressively dumping Harrington stock. Within the span of 2 hours, a multi-billion-dollar empire had been reduced to a toxic, radioactive liability. Several high society guests, desperately trying to pivot their allegiances now that the Harringtons were ruined, actually attempted to arrive at the Preston warehouse. They were politely, but immovably, turned away at the gates by David's private security. This night was no longer a networking event for the elite. It was a celebration for the loyal. Later in the evening, the band quieted down, and David Preston stepped up to a microphone near the head table. He held a simple glass of champagne, his eyes scanning the room filled with the people who truly mattered. He looked at Arthur, and then at his daughter, his expression softening into deep, paternal love. "When my beautiful wife Evelyn passed away," David began, his deep voice thick with emotion, "I made her a promise. I promised her that I would protect our daughter from the vultures of the world. Evelyn came from a bloodline that built empires, but she knew better than anyone that true wealth isn't measured in titles, ancient vaults, or the power to intimidate others. True wealth is finding someone who will stand by you when the absolute worst of the storm hits." David walked over to Chloe and Arthur. From his tuxedo pocket, he withdrew a small, intricately carved wooden box. It looked ancient, the dark wood smoothed by generations of touch. "Evelyn didn't want the crown," David said softly, holding the box out to Chloe. "But she did want you to have this when you finally found a man worthy of your heart. She told me to give it to you on your wedding day, to remind you that true nobility is how you treat people, not who your ancestors were." Chloe's hands trembled as she took the box and slowly opened the brass latch. Resting on a bed of faded blue velvet was a heavy, solid gold signet ring. It bore the ancient, undeniable crest of the House of Plantagenet, 3 lions passant guardant. It wasn't a replica. It was the original, historical proof of a bloodline that had outlasted wars, plagues, and time itself. Tears spilled over Chloe's eyelashes. She looked at her father, completely overwhelmed, and then slipped the heavy gold ring onto her right hand. It fit perfectly. Arthur raised his glass, turning to face the intimate crowd, his voice ringing with a newfound, unshakable confidence. "To Evelyn Preston," Arthur toasted, his eyes locking onto his new wife, "and to the greatest decision I have ever made in my life. The Harrington name may burn to the ground tonight, but I am the wealthiest man in the world because I get to wake up next to Chloe tomorrow." The warehouse erupted in genuine roaring applause. Glasses clinked. The jazz band launched into an upbeat, triumphant swing tune, and the dark, bitter shadows of the morning were entirely erased by the warmth of the night. Margaret and Charles Harrington were sitting in separate federal interrogation rooms, stripped of their power, their dignity, and their future. But at the harbor, surrounded by laughter and unpretentious soy, Arthur and Chloe danced under the fairy lights, completely untouchable, proving once and for all that love, armed with the truth, is an absolute force of nature. And that is exactly how a billionaire matriarch's vicious attempt to sabotage a wedding resulted in the absolute destruction of her own empire, all while armed royal knights protected the bride's ancient, secret bloodline. It is a breathtaking reminder that arrogance and cruelty will always face a reckoning, and true love will always find a way to win. Wait. If this insane, true-life wedding drama kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant plot twist, and make sure to subscribe for more unbelievable stories.